Well, I'm a global educator. I've taught in, I think, 11 different countries on 5 continents. I've taught in all sorts of different places. I've taught in Japanese junior high schools, Jamaican slums, elite American schools, schools that travel all over the world. I've taught in some of the most privileged and some of the most underprivileged contexts. And that gives me a particular lens, I think. And I also look at the problem from a very pragmatic standpoint as a teacher having to actually deal with this. I call myself an evolutionary. I think we need to very significantly rethink how we approach systems in the world, in life, in education, and globally. I think it's really important that we take seriously the problems that we face on Earth and that we work intentionally and with love to try to improve the world, but we do so in a way with care. Revolutions hurt people, but we need that level of change with respect to scale. Some context for this problem. I think it's important to recognize that kids not being in school in COVID has a backdrop of kids not being in school in general. So there's a global lack of universal schooling across the world. Countries vary in terms of years of schooling. We all know this. 258 million kids were out of school in 2018 prior to the pandemic. Huge numbers. According to UNESCO, about 20% of primary age out of school kids will never attend schools. Now, we've seen improvement over time. This graph shows that there has been a significant improvement in terms of being able to attain school. There's been increases in gender parity in particular, but we still see massive differences in terms of school completion. That matters. Why? Well, because kids work. It's just the nature of the world. Most kids who are out of school are out of school because they need to be working for their families, given situational contexts. If you need to fetch water and you need to wash clothes, it might not be that important to study, I don't know, say algebra, because it might not be very relevant to your life situation. Another part of the backdrop to this is that there's been a growing youth mental health crisis in the world. These data come from the United States. The US is relatively generalizable, at least to the Anglosphere, with respect to really negative mental health outcomes for kids. Kids have been increasing with respect to feelings of hopelessness and sadness, increased depression, anxiety, increased suicidality, increased non-suicidal self-injury. And these are really significant increases over the last decade of roughly about 40%. And that really matters. I don't know how generalizable these findings are to developing country contexts. I'm very curious to know that, but I think that that is a phenomenon that's really important to bear in mind. The mental health crisis that we're experiencing now predated COVID and was exacerbated by COVID. The current crisis. So this is a really cool map that the World Bank education people created of countries with fully closed schools. Number of students, 681 million as of yesterday. Number of students in countries with partially closed schools, 92 million. And then add that on top of the kids who were never in school in the first place. And we've got a lot of kids who are in a very difficult situation right now. This map shows length of time by number of weeks that kids have been out of school. In Sri Lanka, it's 50 weeks so far. But to what extent is missing school really a problem? I think it's an important question. I think we all come with the assumption that school is important. But if we, I think the fact that so many kids are working and are out of school, out of necessity, raises a question as to whether school in those contexts are necessary in the first place. What's the point of school? Is the point of school to help kids prepare for market economies? Is it to help kids develop as whole humans? I think realistically, it's probably both. At the very least, the reality is that school really makes a difference. There's a huge relationship between education, credentials, and income, as we all know. And for most people, unless you get an education, you don't really have much of a route to upward mobility with respect to employment, and therefore to financial freedom, and therefore to self-determination. There are exceptions. I mean, in Toronto, for instance, there was one group of people, Portuguese people in particular, who did less well in schools on average, but they did less well in schools on average because parents took them out of schools to put them into construction work to make a ton more money than I make. So it's not always bad that people are out of school. And moreover, not all cultures equally value master's degrees and working 70-hour weeks. And maybe it would be better if we were able to learn from cultures that value those kind of ways of being a little bit less, especially given the pressures that we're putting on our climate. I think school matters because it's a basic human right. It's a right of the child. It's Article 28 of the UN Convention on the Right of the Child. It's SDG number 4. I think school really matters. I think we probably all agree, but not all school systems are created equally. As we know, these are data from PISA. Just that kids go to school at all doesn't tell us much about the quality of education that occurs within that building. So you can go to school for 7 years, but have 7 years of terrible education. Or you can go to schools in a place like Singapore, where if you go to school, you're probably going to come out a very, very good reader. You might not come out with as advanced, maybe creative abilities or entrepreneurial mindsets. That's debatable. Trade-offs are made. But this matters because when we come to learning loss, if it happens at all, it's going to happen in very different ways in different places. And that's important to recognize. It doesn't happen equally. This is a really interesting study that I encountered yesterday. It's looking at one of the best case scenarios for the pandemic. It was a natural experiment that occurred in the Netherlands. You had kids who were out of school right before and after a national exam. And so they were able to actually test out the impact of Zoom school, of being at home. And this is a great situation because it was a short lockdown, only 8 weeks. There was relatively equitable school funding in this scenario, and they all had amazing internet access. So this is kind of the best situation, right? How well can they handle this? They studied 350,000 kids and they found that learning loss occurred nonetheless. So even if you have really, really ideal resources at hand, it's not automatically going to be the case that teachers are going to be able to transition to teaching online in ways that are going to produce the same levels of measurable achievement. I think that kind of matters. Is substantial learning loss online inevitable? That's a question. And why does learning loss really matter anyway? Well, I think learning loss is inevitable within the system. Learning loss occurs and has been occurring since the system was created with summer breaks. Summer learning loss is a normal school system attribute. About 25 to 30% of what's learned in a school year is lost over that break because of the nature of human memory. We are forgetting animals. We forget far more than we remember, and we only remember well with significant repetition spaced over time. Moreover, the shift to online learning was totally unplanned. Nobody was ready for this. There were very few places in the world were able to handle this. And the truth is, as our last speaker pointed out, teachers have been learning. They will improve their practices. They will get better and better at this. That said, though, I do think digital learning will nonetheless remain inferior as a teacher. Having dealt with this for the last year, I think that for a lot of reasons, it's inferior. It's slower. It takes a lot more time to plan. I'm less able to adapt like instantaneously to student needs. There's a lot of technological kerfufflery and problems that happen. And I think it will remain inferior, at least until AI improves very, very significantly. And I think that'll be at least 10 or 15 years. That's just a guess, though. Does it matter? Well, I think learning loss actually wouldn't matter if we didn't care about the system so much. Learning loss is a product of this educational system. The fact is, kids are learning all the time. Kids are natural learners. The question is, what are they learning and to what extent? And do we care about those things that they're learning? School systems were designed by Prussians to, in militarized, industrialized contexts, to educate masses of people from very low levels of education to high levels of education in unfair ways. They were designed intentionally to sort people out, to select the so-called like better people for more privileged managerial roles in society. And this was done on the basis of class, race, gender, and ability on purpose. The systems that we have now work the way they were designed to. The problem is that the system was designed for students to adapt to this system in a competitive way and to be excluded from the system. It was designed to create losers. But we have evolved culturally in terms of our expectations. We've become more caring people. The circle of compassion, as Gandhi put it, has expanded. We now care about equity, inclusion, equal opportunities, and outcomes for kids all over the world. That's awesome. But to get there, we need to rethink this system. Yeah, I just do not believe that we're going to be able to jig with it forever to eventually get to a point of equity, because the fundamental design is hegemonic and designed for the opposite. I think learning loss matters because we've made it matter. Kids are going to be forced to adapt. They're not going to get the support they need, and they will and are suffering the consequences. Mental health. So we have a learning loss problem, we have a mental health problem. This is US data on mental health outcomes with respect to anxiety and depressive disorders over the last year. Very, very significant increase for adults. According to the OECD, COVID-19 has turned into a mental health crisis for young people. Again, there was already a mental health crisis. This is exacerbating the mental health crisis, and we don't truly know the extent of it. We just don't have the data yet. Some data indicate that mental health disorders have more than doubled for young people. And it is the case that young people are more likely to report, not necessarily experience, but at least report anxiety and depression far more than older people. So it could be the case that the rates for young people are even greater than that graph that I just showed you. I think this is really, really, really important. For me, the mental health crisis vastly outweighs the learning loss crisis. And I think that's what we need to put attention on most. I work at a very, it's actually my last day of work. I've got a few more official days, but basically I'm done at Think Global School. It's been an amazing experience. Think Global School is a school that travels to, or used to pre-COVID, 4 countries a year on 6 continents over a 3-year cycle. We specialize in experiential place-based learning from the locals in country contexts about things that matter, and helping students design project-based learning, helping them figure out who they are, what it is that they care about, what they're passionate about, and then designing their own learning projects around that to really deliver the kind of results that you get with when you really bolster human motivation, intrinsic motivation in particular. It's an amazing school. It's very cool. And at TGS, we have no learning loss. It doesn't exist because we don't measure learning the way normal schools do. If you don't measure learning the way normal schools do, learning loss doesn't exist. It just doesn't. We have a flexible adaptive curriculum. Teachers design place-based experiential modules, and students design their own learning. We put a tremendous amount of emphasis on advisory, small group sessions to affect belonging, one-on-one sessions to support students, on personal project mentoring, and on counseling. Social and emotional learning is embedded in everything that we do. How did we respond to this? Well, we were able to adapt to student needs, unlike the vast majority of teachers on the planet. So we designed modules on misinformation and critical media literacy because there was a lot of that going on. We saw that our students' mental health was really declining. And so we pushed for and were able to design modules solely focused on mental health for an entire term. And then kids could do their own thing at the same time. Did modules on design thinking, and we did a whole term that we just finished on service learning, kids doing active service learning projects in their own communities. It was great. Moreover, kids were doing their own thing already, and we just continued that. Very, very simple for us to adapt. I was probably in the luckiest situation on earth as a teacher during this. Is TGS replicable and scalable? The answer is no. You don't want to replicate a traveling high school. It's just not good for the world. And also, it's not really that necessary. There's a lot of other arguments against that. So let's just put that out. But I do think there are things to be learned that matter when we think about how to support kids in the short term. Getting back to normal. I think we need to really de-emphasize learning loss. We need to emphasize resilience, growth, and especially human connection, belonging. Get kids connected, let them be kids, and the resilience will happen naturally. It's easier for them. I would suggest, if I were a principal, I would be looking at the curriculum. I would be saying, okay, let's prioritize. Not all subjects are equal in terms of not just their importance, but also their nature in terms of how they must be taught and learned. So for instance, math is a cumulative subject. You miss 4 weeks of math and you go back to math class and you are behind and you're not going to get caught up unless you go back. So math has to have a mastery-based approach, which, by the way, is why Singapore is so amazing at math, because they make sure every kid is constantly learning and not falling behind. So certain subjects like that really need to emphasize the mastery of lost concepts and skills. I think it's really important to emphasize individualized support, really getting kids to work with it effectively as givers and receivers of feedback. If you can really do that, then you can accelerate it really quickly. That's the key. For non-cumulative subjects, so I teach a lot of non-cumulative subjects, social science things, history, stuff like that. This is easy. The content is just arbitrary. The fact that like the history textbook has chosen these events is completely contestable. Indeed, it should be contested, and it's racist if you actually look at it in almost any country context. And because of that, I think it behooves us to make very serious choices. We should be choosing to focus on things that are relevant to kids, that are important, and then we can problematize curriculum in ways that are interesting to really engage students. It's actually not that hard if you have the power to do it. That said, I think this is the most important point I want to make. This is a great book. I strongly recommend every educator on earth read this book, The Self-Driven Child. I think the purpose of education is to help kids fundamentally determine their own lives, to be able to be self-directed in choosing what it is that they want to do with their lives. And how do you get people to do that? You have to help them learn how to learn. And you learn how to learn through the process of trial and error and making choices. In this context, kids have been massively deprived of choices. Go to school, don't go to school, learn online, learn in class with your teacher, with kids on the internet, just craziness. And they've constantly, throughout this, been deprived of choice at every single stage. When have the kids ever been asked, what should we do? A low sense of control may very well be the most stressful thing in the universe. It really does create chronic stress, which inhibits working memory, depletes the ability to learn, and has all sorts of negative behavioral consequences as well. It's really, really important that we give kids control. So I think the answer to both the school system collapse and the mental health fatigue problem is the same, which is to support kids to make meaningful choices about their own education, to enhance their agency. To the extent that they feel agentic, they will be able to get better at learning how to learn, and they'll be able to adapt in the future if situations like this happen, especially if we support it properly. If our kids knew how to autonomously learn, and they were given credit for it, this is crucial because schooling is largely about credentials and not learning, then much learning loss wouldn't have happened, more learning, meaningful learning would have happened, and we would have had better mental health outcomes. That's what we have at TGS because of the nature of our design. The next crisis. Well, I think the hegemonic school system seriously needs to be replaced with alternative models. I don't really believe in this slow incremental reform of the system because fundamentally the incentives are misaligned to human needs. I think what we need is a proliferation of alternative models with experimentation and research all over the world. I think we really need to prioritize helping kids learn how to learn by designing and assessing their own projects for credit. And I really think we need to center social and emotional learning throughout everything that we do. With respect to policy, I think this means that we should reform curricula to prioritize student design project-based learning. This is possible. It's not easy, but it gets easy if you start early with kids when they're young and you have really good systems to be able to scaffold that throughout. I'm not saying only or shift systems entirely to project-based learning. In fact, I would say don't do that because you'll get worse outcomes with respect to knowledge development. I think it's important to have both. We want the accumulation of knowledge, but we also want to have kids build agency and self-direction. And we can do both, but only if we emphasize both. And currently we don't emphasize agency at all. I think we need to invest in teacher development. I think we need to decentralize school authority so that schools can make local decisions based on local needs, give teachers the power to be able to adapt to situations as best they can, make strong decisions in the interests of their students. We have to have internet access in the 2020s, 2030s, 2040s, 2050s. For the rest of this century, it's a basic human right. Kids do not have equal opportunity to learn unless and until every single kid on earth has excellent tech and excellent access to that tech. But access without support is not opportunity. And so we need a lot of emphasis on development. I think we need to invest seriously in research on educational technology. Not all apps are equal. Not all learning resources are equal. Just giving people access to the internet is insufficient. It's really matters what you do with it. And training is, to me, it's kind of everything. And the reason I come back to this is so we can make all these policy recommendations, you can pass all these policies, but it takes forever for that to actually trickle down to the classroom because teachers become a blocking point. If there's a dissonance between teacher understanding and what they're being asked to do, then what they're being asked to do doesn't happen. We see this around the world with respect to education reform. Formative assessment is a great example. Nobody in the world disagrees that formative assessment really matters. It's in every policy recommendation on earth. It's in Sri Lanka's policy documents. Yet you can find policy documents on, you can find research on the internet from UNESCO, from the OECD, from all these different organizations that will show you again and again that the policies aren't implemented because teachers don't know how. We have to emphasize teacher development, and that takes a lot of investment. It's not easy. Future crises, I think this is important to recognize. We have 7.8 billion people as of this morning. We're going to add 3 billion in the next 80 years, 3 billion. That our planet can't really support this. So we need to really be very conscious of this as in thinking about future preparedness of schools. We have problems now with kids being out of school. Add 3 billion kids to the world. Most of the kids who are born are being born in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So that matters. And most of the places in the world that are highly vulnerable to climate change are also in the places with high fertility rates. According to the IPCC, they're expecting about 200 million climate migrants by 2050. Many of those will be children. I think we prepare for that by rethinking schools and prioritizing helping kids learn how to learn so that when the emergency hits, they'll have things to do. And if we can give kids credit for it, they'll have incentive. Those are my thoughts. I have a podcast, check it out, World Teacher Podcast, and you can reach me at those places. I'm very interested to have a conversation with you all. Thanks so much.